You're on a long stretch of highway, the kind where the exits thin out and the traffic settles into a steady crawl. A torn-up duffel bag sits near the guardrail. Most drivers pass without a second glance, but every so often, someone slows down, convinced that there's more inside than old clothes or trash. Across the country, gruesome discoveries don't usually start with flashing lights and searches. They start in simple, mundane, ordinary events. A jogger in Pima County 2014 cutting across a service road and spotted something half buried near a wash. A utility worker in rural Missouri in 2009 stepping out to check a line and freezing when he realizes what he's looking at. A teenager in Washington State in 2020 filming a day out with friends before the smell hits them and the camera keeps recording. None of them were searching for anything. They were just going about their day when someone else's secret surfaced in front of them. And that's kind of how our story started, with the finds that appeared without warning and the people who stumbled into them before anyone understands what's truly been left behind. Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown, from cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path. Most of these discoveries start when someone is in the middle of something ordinary. A driver pulling over for a mechanical issue, spotting something off to the side. A dog walker following a usual route and noticing the ground ahead looks different than it did the week before. A maintenance crew clearing debris after a storm and stopping when a shape under the brush isn't what they're expecting to find. None of them set out to uncover anything. They were just the first ones close enough to see what had been left where it shouldn't have been. In South Australia, police made a discovery on May 20th, 1999, when they went into an old bank building on Florence Street during an active investigation for a missing person. The place had been closed for years, and the inside still had leftover items from whoever used it last. Officers walked through the front rooms, checking each space as they moved towards the back of the bank. The vault itself was behind a heavy door that had a few things stacked in front of it. They cleared the doorway and opened it. The room was tight with several large plastic barrels lined along the floor with barely enough space in between them, and each one was sealed with clamps and lids. When the lids came off those barrels, the officer saw what had been stored inside of them. 8 bodies, each one packed into those containers lined across the vaulted floor. They had found their missing person, although not alive, and in the process, they had accidentally discovered 7 more victims. On July 15, 1982, 2 boys were out walking near the water of Green River in King County when they noticed something floating close to the bank. At first, they thought it was just some debris. The river carried all kinds of things downstream, but as they got close, they realized that it wasn't just a random hunk of garbage. It was a body. The police arrived and pulled the body of Wendy Lee Caulfield out of the water and started to search the nearby area. Over the next few weeks, more remains were found along that same stretch of shoreline. Most of the discoveries were made by regular people and not actual officers. Overall, the bodies of 49 women would be found between 1982 and 1998. All of them were victims of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. After a string of really rough storms hit South Australia in early 2019, the beach at Scale Bay looked completely different. The tides had pulled so much sand away that parts of the shoreline people normally never saw were suddenly exposed. Someone walking the beach noticed something pale sitting in the newly uncovered sand. At first, it looked like the usual stuff storms washed up, but getting closer made it obvious that it wasn't driftwood or shells. It was human remains, brought to the surface by the erosion, and the condition of the bones made it clear that they had been there for a long time. A similar thing happened in 2016 in British Columbia, this time at George Waterway. A couple of recreational divers were out on February 4th when they spotted something along the riverbed in between the rocks. They reported it, and when authorities came down to check, they recovered partial human remains, including part of a skull. Discoveries like this happen way more often than people think. It's usually not search teams or specialists who first come across them. It's regular people just out living their lives and walking a beach after a storm or driving in a spot that they've been down 100 times. They notice something that stops them for a second, something that makes them take a closer look. And suddenly, they're standing in the middle of a moment that they never expected to be a part of. And that kind of everyday accidental discovery is exactly what brings us to the West Mesa bone collector. Michelle Valdez had a rough start, and it kind of just snowballed on her. Her parents split up and she took it really hard. She ended up living with her dad, but even then she was struggling. By 13, she was pregnant, and she had her daughter right after turning 14. She tried so hard to make it work. She dropped out of school, picked up whatever minimum wage jobs she could find, but it still wasn't enough to support a baby. Eventually, her daughter went to live with Michelle's parents, and Michelle started bouncing between friends' couches and slipping deeper into drugs. Even with everything going on, though, she stayed connected to her daughter. She never stopped trying to be a part of her life. But the trouble kept piling on. She started getting arrested, mostly for drug stuff, and her family kept begging her to get help. They even offered to pay for rehab. Her dad had bailed her out of jail more times than he probably wants to remember. Then, in 2004, Michelle showed up at his place saying that she wanted to get her life together and asking if she could move back in. Her younger sister, who was already living there, had hit her limit with the whole cycle and told her dad that if he let Michelle move back in, she'd move out. So, her dad said no. He drove Michelle to a friend's house, dropped her off, and that was the last time anyone in the family heard from her. So at first he thought she was just mad at him. He figured she was trying to make a point and that she'd call once she cooled off. He even kept a calendar and marked an X for every day that he didn't hear from her. But then the X's started stacking up. She missed Christmas with her daughter. She missed her daughter's birthday. And no matter how upset she might have been, those were some things that she never would have skipped. This is when he finally filed a police report. He wasn't thinking the worst at this point. He just wanted to find her and fix things between them. Michelle had always had this really nomadic way, so she would often disappear for stretches, pop back up, and then drift off again. And because she was doing sex work and using, her life was constantly moving. Different friends' places, different parts of town, never really settling anywhere. Technically, she was listed as a missing person, but it was her family doing all the actual looking, especially her dad. He put up hundreds of flyers hoping someone had seen her. There were even a few streets known for drugs and solicitation, and he'd drive them over and over, slowing down at every corner, checking faces, asking around. He just wanted one person to say, yeah, she was here. Then in July of 2005, he finally gets a call. It's from a new detective that's been assigned to Michelle's case, a woman named Ida, and he thinks, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe she has something, but this isn't an update. It's just her introducing herself, letting him know that she is the one handling things now. It isn't long after the call from the new detective that Michelle's family got this really unsettling phone call from a family friend. Michelle's sister answers, and the friend just opens up with, "I'm so sorry to hear about your sister." And Michelle's sister's standing there like, what are you talking about? Because they hadn't heard anything, no updates or news, nothing. So she tells the friend, I don't know what you mean. And that's when the friend says that she heard that Michelle and someone named Cinnamon had been stabbed 22 times, beheaded, and then buried out on the West Mesa. And Michelle's sister is just stunned because not only had they never heard anything like that, but they don't even know who Cinnamon is. When they ask the friend, where is this coming from? She says that her aunt, who spends a lot of time on the streets, is the one who told her. And that was it. There's no other details, no explanation. This is just a rumor that has been dropped into their laps. So the family calls the police right away, hoping that maybe there's something to either confirm or deny the rumor. but the police couldn't verify any of it. All they did was make a note of the call and added it to Michelle's file. What Michelle's family didn't know at the time was that the name Cinnamon wasn't new to police at all. That detective on Michelle's case, Ida Lopez, she had been building this theory in the back of her mind. She had been watching a pattern of young women disappearing from the same general area, mostly women doing sex work, living high-risk lifestyles, and were kind of homeless, bouncing from place to place. And there was something about their disappearances that just didn't sit right with Ida. She didn't have any proof. It was nothing that she could take to a superior and say, hey, here's the connection. But her gut kept telling her that these cases were tied together. And by the summer of 2005, she already had at least 5 names that she was keeping an eye on. And Cinnamon was one of those names. And here's the really creepy thing about Cinnamon's disappearance. Before she vanished, she had been telling other women on the streets that she had heard girls were being killed and buried out on the West Mesa. Now, Ida didn't share any of this with the families, though. She didn't want to scare them or make any promises that she couldn't back up. And as for searching the West Mesa, it isn't just as simple as grabbing a few officers and heading out there. The Mesa isn't some little patch of land that you can sweep in an afternoon. It's huge. Just this wide open stretch of desert that goes on and on. Even if you had a reason to look, you wouldn't even know where to start. By the time a few years passes, and they were getting into 2008, Ida's list had gotten a lot longer. What had started off as a handful of names had grown into more than a dozen women who'd gone missing under similar circumstances. And because she didn't want to sit around and wait for answers, Ida started doing something most detectives don't do unless they have a body. She went to the families and collected DNA. She wanted to have their DNA on file so that she could compare it to unidentified remains, random Jane Does, and be ready if anything new came in. It was her way of staying ahead of whatever this was, even if she didn't quite know what she was dealing with yet. By this time, Ida had been working on these cases for a while, and she had handled a lot of missing women's files, especially involving women doing sex work. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she kept coming back to this feeling that these girls weren't scattered off or living some new lives somewhere. She really believed that they were all going to be found together one day, whether that meant dead or alive. And by now, her list had grown to 18 names. On February 2nd, 2009, a woman named Christine Ross was out walking the Mesa with her dog, Ruka. It was just a normal walk for them. And then at one point, Ruka came over to her carrying a bone. Christine wasn't sure at first what she was looking at, so she took a picture and sent it to her sister, who worked as a nurse. Her sister texted back that this was for sure a human femur bone. And that was enough for Christine to call it into police. Once Christine's call came in, things moved very quickly. Officers came out, they took one look at that bone, and then they brought in more people to check out the area. And they started to dig. It was almost like this huge archaeological dig. They even had backhoes out there, and they were extremely meticulous. What started out as a single find turned into a full-on dig. They kept recovering more remains, and it wasn't just one person. They'd put together one set of bones, and then another, then a third, and before long they were looking at 7. By the time the work at 118th Street Southwest was done, they had found 11 women buried in shallow graves and the skeletal remains of one unborn child. Now, at first, there was some talk about whether the bones might be from an old burial site, but that idea didn't last long. The remains were too recent. And once they started to identify the women, it became clear how close this was to what Ida had been worried about. 10 out of the 11 victims were on the list that she had been building. One thing that did make the identification move quickly was the work Ida had done years earlier, when she had gone to the families herself and collected DNA long before anyone even knew that there were graves out on the Mesa. When the remains started coming in, the lab had something to compare them to right away. So instead of waiting months or years for answers, they were able to match most of the women in a much shorter time. The victims were Monica Diane Calendaria was 22 when she disappeared on May 15, 2003. Her mom, Isabel, didn't wait around when she realized that something was wrong. She went straight to the county sheriff's detective and told him that someone in their neighborhood had overheard a man named Isaac saying that Monica had been killed and taken out to the West Mesa. Isabel didn't feel like anyone was going to follow up on that, so her family went out there themselves. They spent a month walking the same land where her body would eventually be found years later. Monica had last been seen at Atrisco and Central in southwest Albuquerque. Her family talked about how she loved to laugh, how she was good with babies, and how she enjoyed being around everyone. Victoria Chavez was 26, and she ended up being the first woman that they were able to identify. Her mom reported her missing back in March of 2005, but the truth was that she hadn't been seen in over a year by then. A lot of the women caught up in this lifestyle moved around a lot, so long stretches without contact weren't unusual, and that made it harder for families to know when something was actually wrong. At the time of her disappearance, Victoria had been on probation and had several prostitution convictions, but none of that changed how her family looked at her. They said she loved being outside and she was close with them. When her grave marker was made, they chose the words beloved daughter, mother, and sister. She was loved so much. Her stepfather Ambrose said at a memorial event in 2009, "To have them come and knock on my door, I was devastated. I never thought it would end like this. I just had that hope." Virginia Cloven was 24 when she disappeared on April 13, 2004. She had this big personality. She was funny, expressive, and she was the kind of person who couldn't hide anything even when she tried. Her dad used to say that she'd start to lie about something and then would immediately crack and tell the truth because she just wasn't built for keeping things in. Prior to her disappearance, her life had already been shaken up. Her brother was shot and killed when she was in high school, and not long after that, she ran away. She spent some time living with her grandfather and then later with her boyfriend, who ended up in a coma after being hit by a car. And after that, she really didn't have a stable place to land, so she ended up on the streets. The last time that her dad had heard from her, she had called him before his birthday to ask what he wanted. They had made plans for her to meet him at her grandfather's house, but she never showed up. That was the last contact he had with her. Her father, Robert, has worked tirelessly to try and find his daughter. He even taped pictures of her on the cab of his truck and drove through the seedier parts of town hoping for some sort of answer. Cinnamon Elks was 32 and the oldest of the women who was found. Her mom, Diane Willem, realized something was wrong when Cinnamon didn't reach out on her birthday in August of 2004. That wasn't like her, and she would eventually become the third woman who was identified. Cinnamon had been arrested a lot over the years, with 19 arrests and 14 convictions, most of them tied to prostitution or solicitation. But her family never talked about her like a list of charges. They talked about how beautiful she was. People noticed her when she walked into a room. Her son remembered her smile more than anything. He said that she'd call every year on his birthday for 13 years straight, no matter what was happening in her life. She always made sure that he heard her voice on that day. And then one year, that call didn't come. Cinnamon had 2 kids, and she had a family who loved her and kept hoping that she'd come back. She had also been friends with 3 of the other victims. Doreen Marquez was 24 when she disappeared on October 10th of 2003. She loved jewelry and clothes and had this big personality. In high school, she had been a cheerleader and was known to be always put together. She always had her hair and her nails done. She was a devoted mom, but as her daughters got older, she started using drugs and her life became less stable. Her girls were living with her sister and relatives by the time she disappeared. The last time anyone saw her, she was dropping her kids off at a Christian academy. She also didn't have any arrests for prostitution when she disappeared, and to this day, her daughters still decorate her grave with butterflies and wind chimes. Julie Nieto was 24 when she disappeared on July 15th, 2004. She was tiny, and her mom used to sew clothes for her because nothing ever fit quite right. Before drugs took over her life, she worked with underprivileged kids, teaching them different trades. When she started using, she was 19 years old, and her mom tried more than once to get her into treatment. Julie had 4 prostitution convictions at the time of her disappearance, but her family always talked about her as someone who was bright and capable and deeply loved. When she first was reported missing, it wasn't her family who made the call. 2 women named Melody Camarana and Angela Romero phoned in separate reports about a month apart, each claiming to be related to her. When police talked to Julie's actual family, it turned out that neither of these women had any connection to her at all. Julie did have a real sister that she was extremely close to, named Valerie. Both sisters struggled with drugs, and Valerie died in a hotel room in 2007 from an overdose. Julie's mom, Eleanor, remembered the last time that she saw her daughter. Julie's grandfather had an outpatient procedure that day, and she had been around for that. But not long after, Julie's son had a surgery scheduled, and Julie didn't show up. That was the moment that Eleanor knew something was seriously wrong. Veronica Romero was 28 when she disappeared on Valentine's Day of 2004. She is the one that we know the least about. There aren't many details from her family in the public records, and most of what exists are a few arrest warrants that are tied to her name. However, her family did say that, "We are putting her to rest finally, but considering what's been done, and now we're finding out more about what happened to her, and it's sad. She was hurt really bad." Evelyn Salazar was 27 when she was reported missing on April 3rd of 2004. She was the 10th woman identified from the Mesa. Her 15-year-old cousin Jamie Barella was also found there and was one of the last victims to be identified. The 2 of them had been seen together headed towards a park near San Mateo and Gibson in April of 2004. And that was the last time that anyone saw either of them. Evelyn had a few prostitution-related convictions, but Jamie didn't have any. Jamie was a kid who liked singing and dancing, and most people who knew her described her as outgoing. It's likely that she was just with Evelyn at the wrong moment and got pulled into something that she never should have been anywhere near. And then Michelle Valdez. She was the 2nd woman identified, and she was 4 months pregnant when she disappeared. When the excavation was underway, they found her remains along with the remains of her unborn child in the same grave. All 10 of these women had been on Detective Lopez's list of potentially connected missing women. The outlier was Selena Edwards. She was 15 when she disappeared sometime between late spring and early summer of 2003. She was the only Black victim and the only one who wasn't from New Mexico. She had been a runaway from the foster care system in Lawton, Oklahoma, and no one had ever filed a formal missing persons report on her. She hadn't been seen by her parents since she was about 5, and by the time she left Oklahoma, she was moving around on her own. Investigators believed she was part of what people called circuit girls, teenagers who traveled along the I-40 corridor with older women involved in prostitution. A tipster told police that she had been seen in Denver, spending time around East Colfax Avenue in Aurora, and that she may have been staying at the Ranger Motel. She also went by the nicknames Chocolate and Mimi. Because her profile didn't match the other women's, the detectives hoped that she might point them towards whoever was responsible. They even released photos of her fingernails, which had a very specific painted design, in both Albuquerque and Denver, hoping that the person who did those designs would recognize the work and come forward. But nothing ever came from it, and her case didn't open any new doors for the investigation. During the investigation, they did something really unique for the time. When investigators started to dig into the timeline, they pulled up old satellite images from the years before the bodies were found. In the 2002 images, the whole area was just open desert with a dried-up stream running through it. But by 2004, the road had been cut in, and you could see the tire tracks that were leading straight towards the burial area. There were 3 bare patches on the ground that matched exactly where some of the bodies would eventually be found. And in 2005 images, there were even more tire marks and then 11 bare spots. By 2006, development had started pushing into that part of the Mesa. The land was graded, covered, and marked out for future houses. The satellite photos don't point to a suspect, but they did give investigators a clearer window of time to work with. It's actually a miracle that this desert graveyard was even found. Back in 2005, that whole area on the West Mesa was getting swallowed up by the housing boom. Subdivisions were going up fast, including the one where Ruka and Christine eventually lived. If the economy hadn't crashed in 2008, construction would have kept rolling right across that land. Houses would have been poured, streets paved, and those graves would have been sealed under backyards and driveways. When the financial crash did hit, everything stalled. That site that was supposed to be built out just sat there. And then a big rainstorm came through. It washed out parts of the graded land, and the construction crews had to come back in and fix the mess. Neighbors kept complaining about how the plated area flooded every time it rained. So the developers put in a retaining wall to push the storm water towards the retention pond. That pond ended up being right near the burial area. The runoff shifted the soil enough that the bones started to come up to the surface. All of that, the crash, the stalled construction, the storm, the regrading, was all like the universe putting things in motion just for those girls to be found. Once the identifications came back, it was clear how many of the women Ida had been tracking were part of this case. She'd been tracking 18 women over the years, and 10 of them ended up being the ones found on the Mesa. It raised a real question for investigators. If this many women from her list were buried in one place, was it possible there was another burial site somewhere else? The truth is, this case is a perfect example of why some serial killers never get caught. Most burial sites are never found. They stayed covered by construction or erosion or time or just plain luck. The only reason the West Mesa graves came to light was because everything lined up in this weird accidental chain. When you look at the names on Ida's list, there are still a lot who haven't been found, and it's hard not to think about that. There are still girls out there that never came home. And so, investigators need to dig deeper. The 8 women from Ida's list that are still missing are 32-year-old Martha Lucher, 20-year-old Anna Vigil, 23-year-old Felipe Gonzalez, 21-year-old Nina Huron, 19-year-old Jillian Henderson, 29-year-old Chantel Waits, 23-year-old Leah Pebbles, and 24-year-old Vanessa Reed. In 2010, the ADP did something that threw the whole case into a different direction for a hot minute. They released 6 photos of 7 unidentified women. Pictures that the police wouldn't explain. They wouldn't say where they came from, and they wouldn't say who had taken them. Some of the women in these photos looked unconscious. A lot of them had the same look as the West Mesa victims. The following day, they released another photo, and that woman was quickly identified by her family. She was Christina Leyba from Albuquerque. Her family reached out and explained that she had passed away a few years earlier from a medical issue. These photos, however, triggered a wave of calls. Around 130 new tips came in. A few days later, on December 13th, police said that 2 of the women from the original set of photos had been identified as alive. Problem was, they just didn't know where those women were at that moment. However, they did believe that the 2 might have information that could help if they were located. So police now had a timeline and they had identifications, and they were ready to say out loud what everyone had been thinking. They were dealing with a serial killer. They dubbed it the name the West Mesa Bone Collector. With this, investigators started to shift gears and looked at actual suspects. The police believed that this person was most likely charming and had built some sort of reputation with the girls prior to attacking and killing them. The number 1 suspect was Lorenzo Montoya. He lived just a short distance away from where the women were buried, and he worked as a pressman at the local printing company. He had prior prostitution and rape charges that were dropped, and he was known for being violent towards women working in that area. In December of 2006, he called a 19-year-old woman named Sharika Hill to his place on Blake Road to dance for him. Her boyfriend, 18-year-old Frederick Williams, followed her there. Williams told police that when he got to the house, he saw Montoya trying to put Sharika's body into the trunk of his car. Montoya started shooting at him, and Williams shot back and killed him. Investigators at the time said the scene was so brutal, they did not think that this was the first time that Montoya had killed someone. During the 2009 excavation of West Mesa, investigators found tire tracks leading from the burial area towards a street near Montoya's former home. A co-worker later told police that Montoya had talked about killing women and burying them on the mesa. When detectives searched his home, they found a recording on his camera. The first part showed him having sex with a woman who did not appear to be responsive and was possibly deceased. The video then cut to a view of a wall and a bed, and you can hear sounds in the background that police say match the sound of duct tape being pulled from a roll and a garbage bag being opened. Screenshots of the woman were released, but she has never been identified. Montoya died in 2006, 3 years before the graves were found. Under New Mexico law at the time, his DNA was not entered into CODIS, so it has never been compared to the evidence in the case. ADP Commander Kyle Hartstock has publicly called Montoya their prime suspect and pointed out that the women stopped disappearing around the time that Montoya was killed. The police had also been paying close attention to Joseph Blee in 2014, after a break in one of his older cases. He had been known in Albuquerque since the 1980s as the man people called the mid-school rapist because he targeted girls who lived near McKinley Middle School. Some of those cases had DNA, but the kits weren't tested again until 2010, and that's when one of them finally linked back to him. He also had a landscaping business in South Valley, and he spent a lot of time on Central Ave where sex work was common. One case from the 1990s, a sex worker was found dead off of Central, and his DNA was found on her waistband and belt, but charges were never filed. When the West Mesa investigation was underway, detectives found a tree tag near the burial area that came from a nursery that Joseph used to visit. Around the same time, his wife and daughter told police that they had found some women's underwear and jewelry in their home that didn't belong to either of them. Officers searched the house 8 months into the investigation and confirmed that those items were there. He had also been stopped by police more than 100 times over the years, and in one of those stops, officers found rope and electrical tape in his car after a woman said that he had exposed himself to her. A former cellmate later told investigators that Joseph talked about hiring some of the women who ended up on the West Mesa, and he called them trashy. He had been convicted in 2015 on rape and kidnapping charges from cases that stretched from 1988 to 1993, and he was sentenced to 90 years. He is serving that sentence now. Even with all the details that pointed in his direction, police have never been able to connect him to the West Mesa burials. Back in August of 2010, detectives showed up in Joplin, Missouri, because they wanted to look at a photographer named Ron Irwin. He had a studio there and spent a lot of time traveling around taking pictures, including trips to the New Mexico State Fair during the years that the women were disappearing. The police searched several of his properties and took tens of thousands of photos. They didn't explain much to him at the time, just that it was connected to the West Mesa investigation. The search hit him hard. His business dropped off almost immediately, and people in town started treating him like he was already guilty. He later said that he couldn't get work, and even people who had known him for years didn't want to be around him. The accusation of being a possible suspect absolutely devastated him. The photos that the police took from him were never returned, and he said losing that archive wiped out decades of his work. As the investigation went on, the detectives eventually told him that he wasn't their guy. He took a polygraph, answered every question they had, and they eventually cleared him. The problem was, the damage was already done. His name had been tied to a serial murder case, and even after police said he wasn't involved, his career never recovered. There was also this tip from Crime Stoppers that came in back in 2010 about a guy with the last name Coda. The caller said that they knew about murders tied to a man who was about to be executed in Texas, and they believed that Coda was the one who actually did it. This person said that 2 of the victims possibly went by the name either Mimi or Chocolate, and those were the names that Selena Edwards had used. The caller didn't claim that Coda ever admitted to killing anyone, just that he talked about picking up women and paying them for sex. They described him as someone who had been in the El Salvador's military special forces, someone who could be violent, and someone who talked about women in a way that made the caller extremely uneasy. They said that he was in his mid-50s at the time, thin, with reddish hair, and drove a light burgundy van. They also said that he worked as a long-haul truck driver and had lived in both Albuquerque and West Oakland. That tip lined up pretty well with what detectives were already trying to figure out about Selena Edwards. She was from Oklahoma. She had been seen in Texas and Colorado before ending up in Albuquerque. Her movements made investigators look at the possibility that she had been pulled into a trafficking route along the stretch through Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, and even into Juarez.
On Canada's east coast, the Atlantic isn't the only thing that's dark and restless. It Came from the Maritimes is co-hosted by siblings Evan and Chelsea, who share the region's fog-shrouded legends, haunted lighthouses, ghost ships, and chilling folklore passed down through generations. It's maritime history at its most haunting. True crime, eerie local lore, and the mysteries that refuse to stay buried. For those drawn to the strange and storied side of the East Coast, It Came from the Maritimes releases new episodes every week. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
There had already been some arrests in El Paso that pointed to the same route, and the FBI was already looking at long-haul truck drivers in other cases involving murdered sex workers along major highways. So the idea wasn't new to them, and that tip fit into the picture enough for them to take it seriously. But even with everything that the caller had said, nothing came out of it that tied this coda to the West Mesa burials. It ended up being just one more lead that never turned into anything solid. There are a few other men whose names floated through the investigation, even though none of them ever became strong suspects. One of them was Lou Fred Reynolds. He was in his 60s and known in Albuquerque as a pimp. He died of natural causes in January of 2009, right before the graves were found. When the police searched his place, they found photos of several women who ended up on the Mesa. There wasn't any physical evidence tying him to the burials, but the photos were enough for his name to be added to the list for a while. He had been arrested in 1998 and again in 2001 for promoting prostitution. Another name was Scott Lee Kimball. He was 47 and had been an informant for the FBI at one point. In 2009, he was sentenced to 70 years in Colorado after pleading guilty to killing 4 people between 2003 and 2004. A relative told reporters that investigators were looking at him for possible connections to other deaths, including the West Mesa case. He had spent a lot of his time traveling across different states, so detectives tried to build a time frame of where he would have been. He told them that he didn't kill anyone in New Mexico. And there was also Robert Howard Bruce, who people called the Ether Man. He was 51 when he was sentenced in Oklahoma in 2013 to 177 years for a long list of sex-related attacks that stretched from 1985 to 2001. The police said that he used chloroform and stun guns on his victims. DNA and other evidence connected him to rapes in Albuquerque, Colorado, and Texas. There were attacks in New Mexico as well that got him an additional 156 years added to his sentence. But even with all of that, he has never been tied to any actual homicides. When investigators first started, they pulled together everyone they could. Detectives from different units, FBI profilers, and agencies from around the state were all trying to figure out how 11 women ended up buried on the Mesa. One of the biggest problems was that there wasn't much physical evidence. The bodies had been in the ground for years, and the medical examiner couldn't say exactly how any of the women were killed. There were no gunshot wounds, no obvious signs of blunt force injuries. Investigators think that most of them were probably strangled, but the conditions of the remains made it hard to be certain. The ADP has never said whether they recovered any usable DNA from the site, and the state's DNA laws make that even harder. New Mexico doesn't allow police to upload DNA from someone who's died before they were charged. This meant that they couldn't put Lorenzo Montoya's DNA into CODIS. So the case really didn't give detectives much to work with. The official cause of death for all 11 women was listed as homicidal violence, but that was as far as the medical examiner could go. There were no witnesses. There was no forensic trail. There was nothing at the burial site that tied the women together beyond the fact that they were all found in the same place. Around this time, a private investigator named George Walker started getting strange phone calls and emails from someone claiming that they had information about the killer. The messages were vague and taunting, and nothing useful ever came from them. Over the years, a few other names came up, mostly local pimps or men with long histories of domestic violence, but none of these leads turned into anything solid. The Albuquerque Police Department says that the case is still open. They call it the 118th Street homicides, but they haven't shared much about where the investigation stands now. And when reporters ask, the department usually declines to comment. Not only that, but the department has its own problems to deal with. In 2014, the Department of Justice stepped in after an investigation found a pattern of excessive force, including deadly force, between 2009 and 2012. There were also several scandals involving officers accused of assaulting sex workers. All that pulled attention and resources away from the older cases. With so little information coming from police, the people in Albuquerque have come up with their own theories about who the killer might be. Some point to corrupt officers, others point to drug crews or traffickers. The case has been sitting for so long that it feels like the city has moved on, even though the families haven't. One advocate said that a woman gets dismissed because of how they lived, and that the department doesn't have the budget or the motivation to really put time into a case that's been more than a decade old. Back in 1999, there was a woman named Cynthia Jaramillo who was taken by David Parker Ray, the man that would later be called the Toy Box Killer. He held her in a trailer south of Albuquerque, and she only survived because she managed to get away and get help. After Ray was arrested, she spent years trying to rebuild her life. When the West Mesa victims were found in 2009, she and a woman named Christine Barber started talking about how many women in New Mexico were disappearing without anyone paying attention. That's when the two of them created Safe Streets New Mexico. They wanted a place where women working on the streets could get help because they know how dangerous it was and how often violence against them went ignored. Cynthia had lived it firsthand. Women in that line of work were always at higher risk for attacks, and their cases rarely got the same attention as other missing women. You see it in other places too. People know the name Ted Bundy because his victims were mostly college students, and that case was everywhere. But Gary Ridgway killed almost 50 women over the years, most of them sex workers, and his case never got the same kind of coverage. Cynthia and Christine didn't want the women in Albuquerque to end up forgotten like that. Safe Streets New Mexico became their way of trying to give women some protection and support that they weren't getting elsewhere. One of the women on Ida Lopez's list who hasn't been found is 23-year-old Leah Pebbles. Her dad, John, had spent years trying to find her. He drove through Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Nevada, all looking for a sign of her. He talked to people on Central, he followed up on tips, he even said he got death threats while he was out asking questions. Leah had been on her way to meet a man at the Flying Star Cafe, and she was supposed to start working there a few days later. Before he died, her dad said that he had been told she ended up under the control of a pimp who went by AJ. He was someone who was supplying her with crack. Police said that they checked into that, but nothing came of it. Another family dealing with the same kind of silence was the family of Beatriz Lopez Cubelos. She went missing in 1989, and her sister has been pushing for years to get better laws in place so families can get information when remains are found. She says that the police never really dug into her sister's case, even though 3 men were among the last people to see her alive. She also highlights how the families of the West Mesa victims were treated, how officers would describe these women in ways that made them sound like their lives didn't really matter. Most of the victims' families were low income, and they said that they rarely heard back from detectives, so they ended up doing their own searching and their own investigation. There were also a lot of rumors that the family heard over the years pointing in every direction. Some rumors said that drug dealers were involved. Others would say that the cops were the ones who were taking the women out to the Mesa and assaulting them. There were even stories about traffickers from out of state, but none of it ever turned into anything that the police could confirm. But the families kept hearing the same thing from different people. One of the most difficult stories to hear came from the mother of Jamie Burrell. When investigators told her that Jamie's remains had been identified, 2 detectives came to her house. One of them pulled her aside and told her privately that Jamie had been mutilated, specifically that one of her breasts had been cut off. The autopsy report that was released to the public didn't include that detail, but full reports are only available to the task force. Jamie's mother also said that she had to fight back when the police labeled her as a prostitute. She even went to the city council to say that the only way that they could know is if one of the officers had been a customer. She talked about how her daughter needed help and never got it. She herself has been dealing with cancer and said that she just wants to live long enough to see whoever did this be held accountable. A lot of the families feel the exact same way. They say that the investigation has stalled and that they've stopped getting updates, and it feels like the city is just waiting for people to forget. There is still a $100,000 reward sitting out there, but the families say that the hardest part is the silence, not knowing if anyone is still working on the case or if they're on their own. Diana Willem, Cinnamon Elk's mom, said that she had been getting strange calls for years before the graves were even found. People she didn't know would tell her that Cinnamon had been murdered. One of the callers even said that she had been beheaded. A man named Art Johnson told police that he heard the same thing, but none of it led anywhere, and the police report from that time just said that they were waiting on more leads. Diana said that she had been trying to get the police to pay attention long before the West Mesa site was discovered. She even confronted the police chief back then and told them that many women were disappearing. She said he brushed her off and told her that she was wrong. She remembered telling him that the missing women were only the beginning, and she said that he acted like she didn't know what she was talking about. She said that's how it's always felt for the families, like they were being ignored. She also said that she had gotten a phone call from 15-year-old Jamie Barella before Jamie disappeared. Jamie told her that Cinnamon had been murdered, and when Diane passed that information along to the police, nobody ever followed up with her. She wanted to look into her daughter's case more, but she's been taking care of sick relatives and raising her grandkids, so she hasn't had the time or the resources to do it. She did say that Cinnamon had been in trouble before and would often disappear for stretches. At one time, she had even mentioned going to El Paso with some people, but never fully explained the reason why. Diana always wondered if the girls had crossed paths with the wrong people, maybe even people tied to the drug trade. Now, the police reports do show that Cinnamon had been staying with Art Johnson in northeast Albuquerque before she went missing in August of 2004. He called Diana to say that he hadn't seen her daughter and was worried that something had happened. Diana said that he was an odd guy and that Cinnamon only used his place to keep her clothes. She told him that he needed to report her missing because if he was the last person to see her, he was going to be the first person that the police looked at. His name kept showing up in different reports, even from a probation officer, but nothing ever came from it, and Johnson wouldn't talk to reporters later on. Now, Cinnamon didn't have a car, and Johnson's place was about 13 miles from the area where she usually spent time. So Diana figures that she must have gotten rides from people, but she never knew who. She's always felt like there are answers out there, but nobody wants to say anything, perhaps out of fear. Michelle's family also never got answers about who fathered her unborn baby. People at the time assumed it was the man that she had been seeing who went by the name Tiger, but her family says this wasn't true. Her mother, Karen Jackson, was so desperate to find her that she reached out to 3 different psychics. 2 of them actually worked with the police departments, and one of those psychics even went to the APD, but she said that the detectives brushed her off. One of the psychics actually said that she sensed Michelle was in some sort of gulch, and that the word ranch kept coming up. Later, the bodies were found in a gorge, and that's kind of what the psychic had said. Karen has repeatedly said how hard it was to get anyone to take her seriously. She kept trying to follow every lead that she could find, even the ones that sounded strange, because she didn't have anything else to go on. She said she felt like she was doing the work alone, and that nobody was giving her updates or telling her what was happening with the case. She just wanted someone to help her understand what had happened to her daughter. In June of 2020, the state opened a 1-acre part on the Mesa where the women were found. They call it Women's Memorial Park, and it sits right on the site where the graves were uncovered. Families often go there to leave flowers, photos, and things that belong to the women. It's quiet most days. but people still stop by because it's the only place that feels like a marker for what happened. Even with the park there, the families are still waiting for answers. Some women who went missing around the same time have never been found, and their families are still searching. The case is technically open, but nobody's been arrested and no one has ever even been named. The family is still holding on to whatever hope they have left, because they don't want the women who are still missing to disappear from the story. Thank you for walking down this crooked path with me. Take with you a good memory, a sharp question, and the reminder that someone's story always deserves to be heard. I'm Amanda Joy, signing off. Follow the path further. If this episode left you lingering in the shadows, there's more to explore. Follow Down the Crooked Path on TikTok and Instagram for haunting visuals, behind-the-scenes lore, and updates on upcoming episodes. Every post is another breadcrumb deeper into the strange, the forgotten, and the beautifully unsettling. Stay curious and keep walking.